Once upon a time, in the small, quiet town of Enugu, there was a family that everyone admired. Mr. and Mrs. Okafo were kind, hard-working parents, and their children, Amara and Marco, were the pride of the neighborhood. Amara was the older child, a cheerful girl with a smile that could light up a dark room. Marco, the quiet one, followed his sister everywhere like her shadow. If Amara laughed, Marco laughed too. If she cried, he wiped her tears. They were inseparable. Their parents were busy people, always working to provide for the family. Most afternoons, Amara and Marco were left alone in the house. They would play games, tell stories, and sometimes just sit together in silence. At night, they even shared the same bed, whispering to each other about their dreams and fears. One afternoon, Marco ran into Amara's room with excitement in his eyes. "Amara, see what I have," he said, holding up a shiny smartphone. Their father had bought it for him recently. Marco had taken it to school that day, and some older boys had shown him how to visit strange places on the internet, such as websites meant only for adults. "What is it?" Amara asked, curious as ever. "Come and see," Marco replied, climbing onto her bed. He opened the phone and showed her a video. The screen was filled with strange images of grown-ups doing things neither of them understood. Amara frowned at first. "What are they doing?" she asked. "I don't know," Marco said, giggling. "But it's funny. It's making me feel good. Let's watch more," he added, smiling gently. "Me too. My body is feeling sweet," Amara responded, focusing more on the phone screen. And so they did. At first, it was just curiosity, like watching a strange animal in the forest. They didn't understand what they were seeing, but they couldn't stop watching. Each video brought more whispers, giggles, and strange feelings. The more they watched, the deeper their bond grew. It became their little secret, something only the two of them shared. In the quiet of the house, the Okafo children began a journey they didn't fully understand, a journey that would change everything. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The little secret Amara and Marco shared grew like a small seed planted in fertile soil. Every afternoon when the house was quiet and their parents were away, they would sit together, staring at the screen. Each video stirred something new in them, curiosity, confusion, and a strange excitement they couldn't explain. One sunny afternoon, Marco leaned closer to Amara and whispered, "Let's try what they're doing." Amara blinked, her heart racing. "What if Mama finds out?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She won't," Marco said, smiling confidently. "It's just you and me." Amara hesitated, her mind swirling with questions, but she trusted Marco. He was her shadow, her partner in everything. Slowly, she nodded, and they decided to mimic the things they had seen. At first, it felt like a game, a silly game. Amara lay on the bed, smiling, and Marco positioned her just like they'd seen in the videos. They giggled and teased each other, stopping whenever one of them got too nervous. From that first day, they couldn't stop. They continued every afternoon whenever their parents weren't home. Gradually, they even started doing it at night without their parents noticing, as they both shared the same room and bed. "It's a bit painful," Amara would say, but Marco, already enjoying the moment, would use his hands to cover her mouth so she wouldn't scream out. Mr. and Mrs. Okafo, in their own room, believed Marco and Amara were having a good sleep, just like them. Little did they know their children were, in fact, having a good time together instead of a good sleep. Years passed, and by the time Amara was 14 and Marco was 12, their secret had grown deeper than they ever imagined. It was no longer a game, but something they didn't know how to stop. At night, as they lay in bed, the weight of their actions pressed on their hearts. "Marco," Amara whispered one night, "do you think this is wrong?" Marco was silent for a moment before replying, "It's just us, Amara. No one else will know." Their bond, once innocent and pure, now held them captive. They didn't know how to escape the web they had woven, and so they stayed silent, carrying their secret like a heavy stone in their hearts. The quiet house that once felt like a safe haven now felt like a cage. A few years passed, and Amara had grown into a beautiful young woman of 18, while Marco, now 16, was taller, with a voice that had deepened. But their bond, built on years of secrets, remained unbroken. The once innocent games they played as children had turned into something far more dangerous. One evening, Marco sat on Amara's bed, his face serious. "Amara," he said softly, "I think we should use protection. It's safer. Let's try it, just like we've seen in those videos." Amara's eyes widened. "Protection? Marco, are you crazy? What if someone sees you buying it?" Marco smiled, trying to calm her. "Don't worry. I'll be careful. No one will know." The next day, Marco went to the pharmacy, his heart pounding as he approached the counter. The pharmacist barely glanced at him as she handed over the small box. Relieved, Marco hurried home, tucking the box deep into his pocket. But as he entered the living room, he didn't notice it slip from his pocket onto the floor. "Marco, what is this?" Mr. Okafo's thunderous voice filled the room. He held up the pack, his eyes burning with suspicion. Marco froze, his mind racing for an excuse. It's for a school practical," he stammered. "Science class." Mr. Okafo frowned, but didn't press further. "Be careful with what you bring into this house," he warned, before tossing the pack onto the table. Terrified by the close call, Amara and Marco decided to be more cautious. But when condoms weren't available, they continued without them. They told themselves everything would be fine, that Marco would pull out when he started feeling it more. But the truth came crashing down when Amara, at 19, began feeling sick. She started vomiting, her hands pale, and experienced dizziness now and then. "I think I'm pregnant," she whispered one evening, tears streaming down her face. Marco's heart sank. "We'll fix this," he said, trying to stay calm. Together, they gathered their savings and went to a local clinic. There, they lied to a nurse, claiming they needed abortion pills for a school experiment. The nurse hesitated, but eventually handed over the pills, warning them to use them carefully. Back home, Amara cried as she took the medication, her body trembling with fear and guilt. Marco sat by her side, holding her hand. "No one will ever know," he whispered, though his voice shook with doubt. But it didn't stop there. The secret, like a shadow, grew darker. Each time Amara found herself in the same situation, they repeated the process, coming up with different lies to different nurses at various clinics and pharmacies, hiding their shame. Over time, the repeated abortions began to take a toll on Amara's body, though she didn't fully understand the damage. Little did she know she was risking not just her life, but her future, as she remained unaware of the long-term effects of the abortion drugs she was taking. The once close bond now felt like a chain, binding them to a secret spiraling out of control. Years passed, and it was now time for Amara to find a husband. Amara was 24 when she met Chuka, a kind man with a heart as big as his wealth. He fell for her almost immediately, and Amara, seeing a chance to leave her past behind, allowed herself to love him too. Chuka treated her like a queen, and before long, he proposed with a sparkling diamond ring. Amara accepted, believing this was her way out, a chance to escape the dark shadow of her past with Marco. After the wedding, Amara ended things with her brother. "We can't do this anymore," she said firmly, avoiding his gaze. Marco's voice cracked as he replied, "Amara, you can't leave me like this." "I have to," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is my chance to start over." Marco was heartbroken, but he let her go, though the weight of their shared secret remained heavy on both their hearts. 3 years into her marriage, Amara still hadn't conceived. Chuka, eager to have children, remained patient, but whispers began circulating in the neighborhood. Her parents, worried, turned to prayer, fasting, and even a prophet who gave them holy water to help Amara conceive. But nothing worked. "Let's see a doctor," Chuka suggested one day, his voice gentle but insistent. Amara hesitated but eventually agreed. They visited one doctor after another, each delivering the same devastating news. Finally, a kind but serious doctor sat her down. "Madam," he said gently, "your womb has been severely damaged from repeated abortions. It may be impossible for you to conceive." The words hit Amara like a thunderclap, shattering her heart into 1,000 pieces. Tears streamed down her face as she left the hospital, Chuka walking beside her in silence. At home that evening, Chuka confronted her. "Amara, I need to know the truth. What happened? Why didn't you tell me?" Her parents, sensing something was wrong, joined the conversation. "Amara, Talk to us, her mother pleaded. The pressure was too much. Sobbing, Amara finally broke down. Marco and we started when we were kids, she admitted, her voice shaking. I got pregnant many times and had abortions. I didn't know what else to do. Her mother's wail filled the room, raw and piercing. Oh my God, my children, she cried, clutching her chest. Her father sat frozen, his face pale, as if life had been drained from him. Chuka stared at Amara, his expression a mixture of shock and betrayal. You hid this from me all these years? I'm sorry, Amara whispered, her voice barely audible through her tears. I didn't know how to tell you. The once happy home was now filled with grief, anger, and silence. The truth, buried for so long, had finally come to light, and its weight was too much for anyone to bear. The air in the room was thick with silence after Amara's confession. Her mother's cries echoed, and Chuka stood in stunned disbelief. Amara buried her face in her hands, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Then, breaking the heavy silence, Mr. Okafor cleared his throat, his voice low and shaky as he spoke. I knew this would happen right from the time Marco was born, he began, his words weighed down with guilt. Everyone turned to him, their tear-streaked faces filled with confusion. What do you mean, Papa? Amara asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Okafor took a deep breath and looked at his wife. She nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue. Marco isn't your real brother, he said heavily. The words hung in the air like a sharp blade, cutting through the room. Everyone froze. Amara's mouth fell open, and Marco's eyes widened in shock. Mrs. Okafor spoke next, her voice soft but filled with sorrow. After we had you, Amara, I couldn't have any more children. The doctors said my womb was too weak. But your father's family, they demanded a son. They said if I didn't give him a male child, they would send me away. She paused, tears streaming down her face. We were desperate, so we adopted Marco the day he was born. He was just a baby. We thought it was the only way to keep our family together. We never meant for this to happen. Amara's chest tightened, her heart pounding like a drum. You lied to us, she screamed, her voice shaking with anger and pain. Why didn't you tell us? Do you know what you've done? Marco, who had been silent, stood abruptly, his face pale, his lips pressed tightly together. Without saying a word, he turned and walked out of the house. Marco, wait! Amara called after him, but he didn't stop. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the room like thunder. Amara turned back to her parents, her eyes filled with tears and rage. You kept this from us our whole lives. How could you? Mr. and Mrs. Okafor sat in silence, their heads bowed. They had no answers, no excuses. What they thought was a way to protect their family had instead torn it apart. The house, once warm and filled with laughter, now felt cold and broken. The weight of two devastating secrets had shattered the foundation of the Okafor family, leaving nothing but pain and regret in its wake. The days that followed were filled with silence and uncertainty. Marco had not returned home, and no one knew where he had gone. Amara's mind was in turmoil, a storm of guilt, anger, and confusion. She couldn't stop replaying her parents' confession and the look on Marco's face as he walked out the door. Chuka, though hurt, remained supportive. We need to move forward, Amara, he said gently one evening. The past is painful, but we can't let it destroy us. I still love you, but we need to rebuild trust. That starts with honesty. No more secrets. Amara nodded, tears in her eyes. Thank you, Chuka, she whispered. I don't deserve your kindness, but I promise to do better. Despite his reassurances, the marriage was strained. The weight of Amara's confession lingered between them, a silent barrier they both struggled to overcome. Meanwhile, Marco had sought refuge in a distant city, renting a small apartment and cutting off all contact with his family. The revelation of his adoption, coupled with the guilt and shame of his relationship with Amara, left him lost and broken. He spent his days wandering aimlessly, haunted by memories of his past and questions about his identity. One evening, Marco decided to confront his pain head-on. He reached out to a counselor he found online, someone who specialized in trauma and identity issues. For the first time, he opened up about his life, his feelings for Amara, and the truth about his adoption. The counselor listened patiently, offering no judgment, only compassion. You've been carrying a heavy burden, Marco, she said gently, But the choices you make now can shape your future. It's never too late to seek healing and forgiveness, for yourself and for others. Her words resonated deeply with Marco, and he began to attend regular sessions. Slowly, he started to piece together the fragments of his life, finding a sense of self that wasn't tied to his past mistakes. Back at the Okafo household, Amara's parents were grappling with their own guilt. They sought solace in their faith, attending counseling sessions at their church and working to rebuild their fractured family. Mrs. Okafo reached out to Marco repeatedly, leaving voicemails and sending messages, but he remained silent. One day, after months of no contact, Marco finally called. His voice was calm but distant. "I've been thinking a lot," he said. "I don't hate you, Mama. I don't even hate Papa, but I need time to figure out who I am. I don't know if I can come back yet." His mother wept, grateful just to hear his voice. "Take all the time you need, my son," she said. "We'll be here when you're ready." Amara, too, was on her own journey of healing. She joined a support group for women who had experienced infertility and began volunteering at a local children's shelter. Helping others brought her a sense of purpose and allowed her to channel her pain into something positive. One day, while at the shelter, Amara met a little girl named Ada, whose bright smile and lively spirit reminded her of the joy she once had. Ada was an orphan, and the two quickly formed a bond. Over time, Amara began to see adoption as a way to fill the void in her life and give a child the love she couldn't provide biologically. When she shared her thoughts with Chuka, he was initially hesitant. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked. "I think I am," Amara replied. "This isn't just about me. It's about giving a child a chance at a better life. We can do this together." After much thought and prayer, Chuka agreed. They began the adoption process, and a year later, Ada officially became a part of their family. Her laughter and energy brought new life to their home, and for the first time in years, Amara felt a glimmer of hope. As time passed, Marco began to reconnect with his family. He returned home for a visit, his demeanor more grounded and mature. The reunion was emotional but healing, as the family worked to mend the broken pieces of their relationships. "I'm sorry for everything," Marco said to Amara one evening. "For the pain I caused you, for the choices we made. I hope one day you can forgive me." Amara nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I forgive you, Marco, and I hope you can forgive me too." Life was far from perfect, but the Okafo family had found a path toward healing. They learned that the past, no matter how painful, didn't have to define their future. Through honesty, forgiveness, and love, they began to rebuild, one step at a time.